Okay, we're live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Paratus live stream interview thing, whatever we call this. I'm doing this over two platforms at the moment. So I've got the Facebook people and the YouTube people watching the same broadcast on separate channels, if we can call it that. So any of you watching on Facebook, please feel free to go watch on YouTube. I'm trying to migrate the audience across to YouTube because Facebook shadow banned me for a week, and I really don't feel like going through that ever again. Be that as it may, tonight I've got Stefan Meyer here. He's going to introduce himself very shortly. Stefan's been writing for Paratus extensively. I've published a whole bunch of his articles. He's a great writer. We are aware of the echo. The echo is on Stefan's side, unfortunately, because we couldn't get the headset thing working. So please just bear with us. I know the echo sucks. I'll try edit it out and post, but for the live streamers, sorry about the grading. Stefan's written for me a lot. He's multi-talented, he's multifaceted, he's a very interesting guy. So Stefan, tell us a bit, who are you?
Well, I used to work in the gun trade for a while. It started off as a part-time job while I was studying psychology. The psychology never panned out because the university had technical difficulties which lost several thousand students' registrations. After leaving the gun trade, I migrated into the construction-related industries as a quality assurance inspector, and then in between everything, we've been vegetable gardening and doing other things for years. I think my writing ability is somewhat overstated now, but other than that, it's call it an amateur hobby.
Oh, well, that's a fairly decent introduction. By the way, what we can do is if you can mute your microphone, Stefan, when I'm talking, I think that might kill the echo. Let's just try that quickly, and that'll hopefully make people happy. Yeah, echo is gone, I think. Not yet. There we go. So I hope that solves the story. So Stefan is my go-to guy for a lot of stuff. And tonight we're going to discuss something I think that's quite relevant in the South African context, especially the post-lockdown context, and that's hydroponics. What I know of hydroponics myself is scary. I know almost nothing. Stefan knows a hell of a lot. I've seen his hydroponics setup. It's a really decent setup. Including the fish that he manages to keep alive in it. So I'd say of everyone that I know, I've seen Stefan manufacture, run, use a hydroponic system that he got up to speed himself with pretty well demonstrated success. So Stefan, tell us a little bit about it, how you got into it, how you started it, how you got the materials or got, we can start at the very beginning, maybe. How did you investigate and explore hydroponics?
Okay, well, it's either a very long story or I'm going to try and summarize it for length. What we use is technically called aquaponics, which is slightly different from hydroponics in that it uses a larger tank of water that has fish, and you both farm fish, and then instead of having a filter, you use a grow bed with gravel that then filters out the nutrients. The nitrogen and the ammonia that is bad for the fish actually work for plants. The ammonia breaks down, and it's a long chemical process, but it's the ammonia gives the plants the nutrients, the nitrogen that they need to grow. So it's a system that we started using. Hydroponics is just plants growing in water. It's a grossly overstated way to put it, but it's essentially water-based plant growing that you can do in a very limited space, and especially when you have relatively little water. Counterintuitively, a lot of these systems use less water than conventional gardening, in that if your setup is correct, you can use only the water, or your water loss is through evaporation, where the plants are evaporating in the ground, as well as water that just leaves the ground through either direct evaporation or it just sinks into the bed groundwater, and eventually you lose a lot of water that way. So with hydroponics, you use less water, but hydroponics has drawbacks in that you have to replace water fairly often because other nutrients and other chemicals build up that the plants don't use, and then that eventually leads to plants not growing optimally. So the aquaponics replaces the water with a larger quantity of water where you have fish, and then it creates this almost a closed system where it feeds off itself. It uses a lot less space than conventional gardening, and it uses a lot less water if it's run and set up properly. The main advantage is the saving in space and the saving in water. Aquaponics, it's you can buy systems anything from 5,000 to 20,000 rand, or you can build a system for about 3.5. I think that's what we used.
Okay, no, that's pretty much, I think, covers a good part of the introduction. So regarding two things, like how did you start up getting the various pieces together? Like what is your, I'm going to refer to it as an aquaponics system. What does it consist of? And how did you gather the materials? What sort of, is there any specific soil related issues that one must be aware of? There's obviously a lot of stuff that we can talk about further on in the evening pertaining to picking seeds, what type of fish you would try to, I assume, cultivate, if that's the correct phrase, even with a setup like this. So if I wanted to start my own hydroponics or aquaponics setup tomorrow, what would be things I need to consider on this budget from a practical point of view?
Okay, well, the basic system that we have uses a flow bin. That's those big cubicle plastic containers that use, it's usually about 1,000 liter. You get smaller ones, you get slightly bigger ones. You can buy a flow bin secondhand. You get different grades, what they call a food grade, which has never been used for harsh chemicals. They usually go for about 1,500. So you buy a system like that, you cut it up. I mean, you need an angle grinder or a circular saw of some kind, a pump, some piping. The flow bin, you don't exactly cut in half. You have to calculate how much you need in terms of the depth of the grow bed. You need approximately 30 centimeters of gravel to grow effectively. So cut the flow bin a little bit more than 30 centimeters to have the grow bed. You fill that with gravel. It needs to be fairly large gravel. Most of the time you feel like you're using too large stone, but it needs to be about 25 millimeter. It can be larger gravel. The gravel goes in, you fill it with water. It's useful to run it for about a week, so most of the dust just filters out. You use a standard, well, at least we use a standard fish pond pump, where you have a pipe that runs in to the top of the grow bed. There's a system that's called an auto siphon. It's difficult to explain. It's a system that works on the same principle as when you put a pipe into a liquid, suck, and then when the water flows out the pipe by itself, that's the same system, but it's an auto cutoff, very simple to manufacture. It's essentially a valve with no moving parts. You install this in one corner. The opposite corner has the flow where you pipe the water in. When it reaches a certain level, the water will automatically flow out. The most difficult part is calibrating this. It needs to fill up, but the water can't stagnate. It needs to fill and drain consistently and constantly. When it's been running for about a week, you can put the fish in. That then, if you have a normal standard air pump for like an aquarium air stone pump, just to oxidate the water for the fish. When the fish are happy, you can start putting plants in. I'm oversimplifying this. There are various things that you can use and put plants in without any fish. You can start the system off almost immediately, but what I found works easier is get the fish happy, and then as soon as the fish are successful in the tank, you can start planting. We use ours mostly for germinating seed because it's a very useful way. It's very temperature consistent, especially if you use a thermal regulator of some kind. When the plants are growing in the system, they are, one of the main advantages is you can grow them much denser. You normally have, when you plant in soil, you have very specific spacing on plants, whereas with this system, you can plant almost touching. You can have things be very densely packed. The system itself, I think the most expensive part is usually the flow bin. Mine was 1,400 rand. You need the pump, which is going to be about 800 rand. The pipes, 120 rand for all the fittings and attachments. To build the auto siphon, you need PVC pipe, call it 50 rand. The gravel, from what I recall, is about 400 rand for a half cubic meter, 500 rand for a half cubic meter. You won't need, in our system, it uses slightly less than a half cube. When the system is running, fish you can buy from various suppliers. There are plenty of aquaponics suppliers in South Africa. It's growing very quickly. It's proven to be fairly successful and fairly popular. So there are a lot of suppliers. You can buy fish. There are several different species. I would recommend speaking to a supplier of fish before buying, because if you, for instance, put trout in the low veld, the fish are going to probably die because the water is going to heat up too much. They prefer cooler temperatures, whereas other fish want fairly warm water, so they'll do better in the warmer areas. So trout might work well in the Natal Midlands, but it's not going to work that well in the low veld. So again, I'm oversimplifying, and it's not really all that accurate in the specific, but broadly speaking, I'd recommend speak to the people that you buy most of this stuff from, especially if you go to a proper supplier. They will then be able to give you the correct fish for your area. The gravel, they can probably supply. They'll have various different types of piping that they can supply. Buying the cheap pipe is not really worth it. There are several different grades. Goedkoop is duurkoop. If you buy the proper stuff, you'll spend more money at the start, but you save over a 2-year period, and you save significantly, especially with the piping. Normal fish pond pipe, the clear pipe, doesn't actually work that well. So spend the money at the setup, and then you'll save over time. The system can be expanded. You can then buy additional grow beds, buy additional flow bins, cut them in half. The system can be expanded significantly. When you start, one flow bin is enough. That will give you, and also it needs to be defined what exactly your goal is. We use ours for growing, like I said, germination of seeds, and then for growing herb-like things, kitchen herbs. If you
Not
want
that kind of herb, not the forbidden herbs.
No. But you probably could. They get a bit tall. The one thing is, this thing is usually about 1/2 to 3/4 of a meter off the ground. So take into account that if you plant something that might get 1.8 meters high, if your crop is 2 meters off the ground, your neighbors will very easily see what's coming over the wall. But growing kitchen herbs, high intensity, call it things that you use, for instance, for medicinal purposes. If you use certain plants that are good for blood pressure, I mean, we've had very good success with things like ginger and turmeric, which are, they're kitchen herbs. We use them for preparing food, but they do have some antibacterial properties, so you can expand this into just like call it a hospital garden. I know many people prefer just growing herbs. If you expand the system by having multiple grow beds, you eventually need a larger water reservoir. The type of fish also impacts. If you have a constant turnover of fish, then the big ones might eat the small ones if you use specific species. So it's better to plan according to the species of fish that you want to have. As long as the fish are happy, the plants will be happy. If you have several different grow beds, several different sizes, you can turn it into a subsistence garden where you live off of this instead of just using it as a supplement. If you have, for instance, a garden where you might have 20 or 30 square meters where you plant things like, for the sake of argument, sweet potato, which could be a staple. I mean, if you're 2 or 3 people, 30 square meters of sweet potato might almost be enough to sustain you, but it gets very boring. So you might be able to then use the aquaponics to supply spring onions, chives, basil. Like I said, we've got ginger and turmeric, various leafy crops. We found that the leaves do very well. Roots and things that grow underground, because of the gravel, they're not necessarily the best option, but with anything that grows above ground, including some things like onions, they can work very well.
Okay, no, that's Stefan, that's a pretty comprehensive overview. And just to let everyone know, there's a lot of questions and comments popping up on the comment section. I can see them all, and we will answer all of those near the end of the stream when we go into the Q&A part of stuff. So don't worry, we're definitely going to answer these questions because it's important. This is a very important topic right now. So just to come back to what you said earlier about using the hydroponics / aquaponics, depending upon your setup, as a supplement for what you're already kind of achieving regarding feeding yourself. I suppose if you have a problem pertaining to available space, that you do not have the gardening space available to actually plant a crop or a vegetable garden of any sort, because any sort of conventional vegetable garden does make a lot of sense, are there significant benefits from aquaponics / hydroponics over conventional vegetable gardens, apart from obviously the fact that it saves a hell of a lot of space, and as we already mentioned, it saves you considerable expenditure on water because it is a lot more water economical. So you're saving space, you're saving water. Are there any other additional benefits to it pertaining to quality of produce, or is that really much more a function of the type of seeds you're using? Because that's the next thing we need to talk about, is what sort of seeds are you actually using in yours?
Well, one of the main advantages for the health conscious would be that by necessity, aquaponics forces you to not use any pesticides. So from the health perspective, you can't put pesticides in because it'll kill the fish, which then kills the plants. So the health benefit, if you want to call it that, is that it is completely organic. Everything that you put in has to be safe to eat. So at any point you can walk up to the thing, pick off anything on there and eat it, and you never have to worry about pesticides and chemicals and artificial fertilizers or anything that has negative impact. The comparison between this and traditional ground planting it's a complicated conversation, because yes and no. Yes, there are many advantages to this, but no, ground planting has many advantages. It depends on what your goal is. I think it needs to be defined. If you have a supply of food and you want to supplement, and instead of eating pop and sauce every night, you want to spice things up a bit, then having some kind of an aquaponics system or hydroponics, which is just using water, no fish, you can then use that for anything that would change the flavor. I mean, it sounds kind of obvious and simple, but it gives you options. It's probably not going to be enough to sustain a family in terms of the volume of calories needed to keep you alive. If you have a standard townhouse where you have a yard of, call it 10 by 10 meter, you might be able to convert the lawn into a traditional garden where you plant, whether it's potatoes, sweet potatoes, cabbages, whatever you want to plant. That might be enough space to keep you alive in terms of the volume. What we like doing is that we've got traditional ground where we plant things that keep us alive in terms of the volume that you have to eat every day. And then the aquaponics is just a supplement. I think the main advantage of having this system is that it gives you year-round access to micronutrients. People forget that 100 years ago, scurvy was an issue. People would die from malnutrition with full bellies. So this gives you the opportunity and the chance to grow things that will allow you to get vitamins that you might not get from a potato. You can grow a year's worth of potatoes, but you'll die if you only eat potato every day. So this is a way to, again, supplement what you're already eating. The seed in of itself is a very long conversation, because there are different seed suppliers. When we think in terms of seeds, you think the rack at almost every shop will have it. There's always a small hardware section, gardening section, and you'll be able to buy always Swiss chard, butternut, tomatoes. There's standard things that you buy. But a lot of this seed is grown from not necessarily genetically modified, but it's often grown to not be sustainable. The tomato plant that you buy, and one of the very common and very popular brands of tomato seed, is what's called the Heinz tomato. It's a tomato that was developed by the Heinz company for making tomato sauce. It's a good tomato. It looks very good. It's exactly the same size every time. It tastes exactly the same every time. It's a very good, consistent tomato, but it's not that good. The person that I would very much like to get to talk about seed is Sean Freeman. I don't know if he's watching. He usually watches. His company specializes in heritage seed. He knows an infinitely larger amount about seed than I do. It's well worth him promoting the seed side of this, because I know enough about tomatoes to buy the correct tomato seed after watching him give a talk on tomatoes. So one of the things that he specifically said is these Heinz tomatoes that you buy at all the shops were not not grown for taste or quality. It was grown to be easy to harvest mechanically. There's a machine that picks these tomatoes, so they have to be exactly the same size, they must be firm, and they have to have a fairly resilient skin so the machine can pick them. Whereas we have tomatoes in our aquaponics system now, a plant that's half a meter high. It's one of the Russian giant varieties. So the tomatoes at this point, there's one that's probably about the size of a small melon. It's going to be several meals from one fruit. It's a variety of tomato that used to be very popular. I don't know why people don't use them more often. They taste much better than the store-bought tomatoes. And that's just one crop, one plant. We can have the same conversation about every leaf herb. We can talk about onions, garlic. There's hundreds of varieties of pumpkins, brinjals, eggplants, whatever you want to call them. Everybody knows the traditional shape and color. The variety is usually called the Black Beauty. It's a very good fruit. They taste good. It's easy to grow, but you get 100 different types, different shapes. Some have big plants, some have small plants. So in terms of the seed, the crop that you plant, whether it's in an aquaponic system or in traditional gardening, the seed is actually the most important part. Heritage seed, and one of the most important aspects of that, is the seed will remain viable. If you don't interbreed with other plants, you can have the same crop for 100 years. The seed, if it's used correctly, and correct is not the correct word, but if you propagate the crop in the optimum way, you buy seed once and you never buy that variety again. And you can build up a seed library where we have a little medicine chest with 100 different types of seed, and we just cycle through that. And every year, I prefer the first fruit, the first millie, the first thing that you get that ripens. I prefer to leave that one. It's usually the best one. Keep that one for seed, and then next year you have again. If you have one tomato, one good green pepper, well, it's going to be a red one, but if you have one fruit with many seeds in, you can plant from one plant, you can create 100 seedlings. So 2 or 3 years in, you have enough seed to not just feed yourself, but everyone you know, and give away to everyone else on your street, and everyone's got food crops. So the seed, it doesn't matter where you plant it, the seed is the most important thing. But ground or aquaponics or hydroponics, focusing on buying the correct crops will give you better results, and planting at the correct times will give you better results. The advantage of hydroponics and aquaponics is that because it's temperature stable, especially if you put a cover over, you can plant almost anything at almost any time of year. You don't have to worry so much about planting a spring crop in the spring. You can give it a month or two extra time. The water temperature can be regulated. For instance, lettuce. We've had fairly good success with lettuce. It's not always pretty, but it's edible throughout the year. Whereas if you plant in the ground, most of South Africa gets far too hot. You can't really plant lettuce in the ground. The ground temperature can't be above 24 Celsius. So with aquaponics, if you regulate the water temperature to be 24 Celsius or 20 Celsius, most of the fish will be happy, and you can plant lettuce throughout the year. Sun placement is also fairly important, but again, you can match your crop to where you have the system and then achieve reasonable success.
Sorry, Stefan, I think that the screen was buffered a bit there. Sorry, I'm just doing. Can you just repeat the thing about sun placement? Just Okay, it looks like we're back. Sorry about that. I just managed to, there we go. I think we're back now. There's been a glitch with regards to, even with an Ethernet cable plugged in, and I'm on a fiber connection, it conks out. So I think we're back. I think I've got you back, Stefan.
Yeah, looks like.
So sorry, you were, I think we cut out where you talked about sun placement, and then we lost the stream from there. So can you just say everything you said from that point onwards again? I'm sorry to you, because you probably didn't even know the thing conked out.
Okay. With placement in the sun, certain plants need certain amounts of sunlight per day. Some plants need 8 hours, some need 6 hours, some need dappled shade. Again, you can match your system with planting the correct seed. You don't necessarily have to build this machine in direct sunlight where it gets full sun. If you have a good spot, one of the things that come into this, and again, this is a very broad, very networked web that you have to consider. Light, you need level ground, you need a solid base, and one of the easy ways to keep water in the system is to connect it to water tanks that you connect to the roof of your house. So placement, let's say for the sake of argument, you've placed this at the corner of your house where you've got easy access to a water tank from the gutter systems. If you have, say, 5 hours of sunlight in the summer, that is enough for certain things. It's not enough for others. So considering the type of crops you plant, certain seed varieties will give you good results with 4 hours of sunlight, whereas the same kind of thing another variety might need 6 hours of sunlight. So planting, if you have a limited amount of space where you can only put a system in one specific spot, matching the crops that you plant in there, you can then achieve a relatively good success by matching what you plant to the requirements of the plant in terms of the heritage seed. I'm kind of rambling a bit there, but if you plant the correct seed and you know the requirements of that plant, you can find within a specific type of plant a variety that will suit your specific facility, if I could put it that way.
No, that sounds perfect, Stefan. And I recall that we had a telephone conversation yesterday or the day before, specifically talking about, no, it was yesterday, so it was Monday, specifically talking about seeds and the importance of heritage seeds and the importance of picking the correct high quality stuff. You had a terrible, terrible experience with a potato that you planted, that you told me about, that had some sort of root-borne nematodes or something, and there's a whole process you have to go through to purge the soil after if you get an infestation like this. So maybe just for clarity, so that the viewers can understand why this is such an important thing, just tell that story again, because it's a pretty good one.
Okay, well, we were given a potato plant. It was a potato that started growing in the pantry. It was given to me by someone. We decided to plant it because it was a nice, healthy plant. About a month after we planted it, it started going downhill. We eventually dug it out. There were no potatoes on the plant. And then everything that we tried to plant there subsequently never worked. It turns out that there's a parasite called root knot nematodes that you can get from contaminated soil. On the potato example, the person that grew these potatoes didn't sterilize the potatoes enough for replanting. They're completely safe for human consumption. You can eat it raw. There's no way that this parasite can affect a human or an animal, but it affects the roots. They basically attach to the root. The plant has a reaction, call it an immune response, and it thickens the bark of the root, which then creates like a nodule, and it reduces the plant's ability to take nutrients out of the soil. If you have root knot nematodes in your soil, we had a potato plant which about 3/4 of a meter to a meter circle, nothing could grow, and it just kind of expands as these worms spread throughout the soil. And it's a microscopic little organism. You can't see them, you can't catch them, but they live in the soil. So we had to eventually sterilize the soil by digging up a hole, and then you pour diesel in it, you burn the hole, you burn that soil, and you let it rest for 18 months. You can plant certain things there that will then drive away or kill. Marigolds are a good example of how you can prevent the growth or the spread of these nematodes. But planting a plant that came from an unreliable source led to 18 months of problems, and it's just one plant. So again, it comes into the importance of using correct seed and a reliable seed. But with the root knot nematodes, which was just one parasite, they just spread very easily. They spread, we talked about the potato, but when our garden, what eventually happened is, because we use mulch, which then it's good for the plants, but it's a very good way to have earthworms. And you put leaf litter on the ground. The earthworms then come, they digest the leaf litter, which adds to the value of your soil. Birds come and they scratch around and they pick up these earthworms. So as far as this bird then hops around and scratches in the soil, it keeps spreading these nematodes. So we had an initial infestation from one potato plant, which spread, and we had to destroy an entire garden worth of plants because nothing would grow there. So pests, it's very easy to get if you use the incorrect seed stock, whether it's now an actual physical seed or a potato, where you just take a potato out of the refrigerator and stick it in the soil. Whatever you use can have long-lasting implications in the soil. If you use a system like hydroponics and aquaponics, there are also risks, but these types of risks are less. There are additional new problems. You can have pests and diseases that originate in the water. So it's not you have no problems, but it'll be different problems. And usually these problems are a little bit easier to solve. And again, with aquaponics, where you use fish, if the fish are happy, the plants are happy. So you focus on keeping the fish alive. If the fish are alive, the whole system is healthy, which is then much less work. Hydroponics, you have to constantly test the nitrogen in the water. You have to test various other chemicals, test the pH of the water, and you have to replace fairly large amounts of water on a regular basis. Whereas with aquaponics, if you balance the water and keep the fish happy, then the system regulates itself to a large extent. If you have a large enough system, it becomes completely self-sustaining. The goal or the guide is to have a system where you have one fish, depending on the species of the fish, but you can have the fish be very dense. It's one fish for approximately 10 to 15 liters of water. So our system, which has a fish tank of 650 liters, we could, in theory, put 65 tilapia and karpers. You can put 65 tilapia in there. The fish don't all grow at exactly the same speed. So you can have 2 years later, you'll have one that's almost adult size, and you can eat that one, and you'll still have small fish. So you don't have to buy 100 fish every year. You buy stock, and then you just replace as you eat the fish, if you decide to eat the fish. I mean, not everyone will want to eat their fish. They tend to get names after 18 months, and then no one wants to eat Tiny and Flipper. So there is a risk of getting attached to your pets, but the fish, eventually they are there for food. The main advantage to aquaponics, it gives you a very good source of protein, whereas most vegetables, the main drawback is they're relatively low on protein. Vegan diet aside, human nutrition, I'm not a nutritionist, I'm not a doctor, but from observation, I know in Africa we always say starch is the African protein, but one of the major sources of malnutrition is a lack of vitamins. You get scurvy, and a lack of protein. If you just eat starch all the time, you're full, you're not hungry, but you're not healthy. You need protein, and the fish are a very good source of protein, and it's in addition to whatever else you eat. So you save a little bit of money, and it's a source of protein that you don't pay tax on. It's essentially, once you've paid the VAT, it's free. And if the fish breed and the system becomes self-sustaining, your initial capital investment, everything after that, apart from the water, and if your system is set up correctly, you get the water from rainwater. So electricity goes in and food comes out. And you can supplement with various There's a few different types of fertilizer that you can use to boost the system if the fish are small. At certain times of the year, the fish will eat less, which means they will then produce less waste. So there is a bit of balancing involved. But again, it's a relatively low cost over a period of time. The initial investment might be a lot more in that you don't dig a garden, put some compost in, plant some plants from the nursery, and then 6 months later you have cabbages. This takes a little bit longer. It takes 2 years or so for the system to settle. But once it's self-sufficient, especially if you use herbs, and I really like using basil, once you've planted one basil plant, you almost never have to fill on basil again, because the one plant will give 3 or 4 seedlings coming up, and you just leave it. And the basil will then self-propagate to the point where it becomes a weed, and you have to throw them away. You have to pull them out because they grow too much. Spring onions and a few other things like spring onions, they are fairly prolific. They grow easily. So if you plant one spring onion, 3 years later, you'll have an aquaponic grow bed filled with spring onions. So it's a useful way to grow certain things relatively quickly throughout the year. And the fish is the added benefit of having protein available immediately. You can have a balanced meal in a space that, if I measure ours, it's probably about 2 meters by 1.5 meters. And that's the entire system. That's everything there is to it. If you use a more elaborate system, if you've got more space, you can have, in a space 3 by 3 meters, you can have a system that will allow you to prepare and grow food and fish for an entire family, meaning a family of, say, 5 people.
Now, that's a major benefit, especially if you think, most people, or a great many people, do not have the luxury of large houses with large outside areas, large backyards, what they can use for cultivating any sort of produce. So, question on the session, because there are quite a few good questions. What are the? There was just a bit of I see the buffering is still a bit of an issue. I'll try and rectify that. But what are the major pitfalls that people new to hydro/aquaponics, or newbies, if you want to call them, that they the traps they fall into in the very beginning? Just maybe just a handful of those that are the most obvious that first come to mind.
Well, I think my problems were over-enthusiasm. Putting in too much. One of the fertilizers that work very well, it's completely organic, is a thing called Seagrow. It's made from kelp. It's a kelp extract. It's completely safe for fish. It's completely organic. So while the fish are small, you supplement with Seagrow. We added more than we should. So a week later, the entire thing was completely green with algae. So go slow. Playing around with the gravel, we had to replace gravel because the first set of gravel, the pH was too low, so the plants didn't do well. Overspending, buying more than you should, again, over-enthusiasm. I think one of the biggest problems we had with the fish were we didn't have an effective lid, so we had birds coming in and trying to steal the fish. There's a few kind of minor area-specific problems we had, but if I was to say, over-enthusiasm would probably be the major drawback. Go slow. The system can operate without fish by using Seagrow or some kind of a kelp extract. So you don't have to put the fish in immediately, spending a lot of money on tilapia, and then it turns out these specific types of fish don't really like what you're doing, and then half the fish die. It's more an emotional setback than a real physical setback. But you emotionally invest in having fish, and then they die, and that's a setback. So don't overinvest. Go slow. Research before you start. Aquaponics is a global thing. I think it's very large in Australia. It's fairly big in South Africa. So there are definitely resources available. There's a huge resource online. There are plenty of places. I know Lanseria has multiple farms where they have specific aquaponics farms. Hackpoort, east of Pretoria, west of Pretoria, not east, west of Pretoria, a small area called Hackpoort. There's a large aquaponics farm there. And it's a commercial farm that runs off aquaponics. So you can buy everything that you need there. In Cullinan, near where we live, there are 2 suppliers of aquaponics supplies, and any one of these people will be happy and enthusiastic to help. So research, don't overspend and don't be over enthusiastic. If you plan effectively and measure twice and cut once, then you won't waste resources, you won't lose enthusiasm, and then, yeah, patience. The system doesn't work from day one. It takes 18 months to stabilize. Our system is about 3 years old now, and it's only now fully self-sufficient, where I don't have to worry about anything. Every morning I feed the fish, and 2-3 times a week we go and pick something.
Okay, thanks. That's that's a fairly decent collection of stuff to avoid. Just for the benefit of everybody, because I think the stream buffered again at the critical point where you were telling us about the resources that are available. If you wanted to go explore the place in Pretoria West, the place in Cullinan, for example, or in Rayton. Just a quick refresher on those two, Stefan, when you get a gap.
Okay, I can't remember most of the company names offhand. I haven't really dealt with them. When we started this, there was no real commercial farming side to it, so we figured it out mostly on our own. But in the last 2.5 years, new resources have come up. Go on the internet and Google Aquaponics Pretoria, and you'll find 6 names. And my experience with phoning these people, finding out about replacing our aging fish, every one of the people were friendly and happy to help. So resources are easy to find. I can't remember the names of the companies now. I think one of them was Aquaponics SA, but I speak under correction there. But yeah, in the Pretoria area, within 30 kilometers of Pretoria, there are multiple resources that will always be on, whether it's social media or just go on Google. But resources are fairly easy to find with internet access.
Fantastic. Thanks, Stefan. So Trevor asks, what fish are you breeding? Tilapia, which we gathered from the comments or from you talking that is indeed tilapia. So is that the most common breed of fish, if one can call it that you would look at doing with a aquaponic setup, or is there a whole bunch of others you explored prior to getting to the tilapia?
Well, tilapia, or I think the common name is Mozambique Kerper. Those are the ones that are commercially available easily. That's what we have. We have tilapia because it was the easiest one to find, and the fish are fairly robust. I'd very much like to try some kind of a catfish. I personally would like to try barber, just for personal reasons. I like the idea of having them. But tilapia is easy to find commercially. You can buy them. The last time it was 10 Rand for a fish, the size they call fingerlings. So it's about the size of a pinky finger. It's a fish that's large enough that you don't really have to worry about keeping them alive and checking them every hour. It's a fish that can feed and look after themselves at that size. It's 10 Rand. If you buy 200, then the price comes down. So again, it depends on whether you're buying commercially, but for small scale, tilapia is the easiest to find, so that's what we use.
Okay, fantastic. That covers the fish. So next question down the line, Graham of the team. He says, Stefan, what is your opinion on he says, Stefan, what is your opinion on Hydroton expanded clay pellets for drip feed or flood drains?
Okay, well, we've always used gravel because it's easy to find.
Stefan is with us. We'll answer the question.
The easiest to find is gravel.
Let's say that again. I lost you there for a moment. It's between the two of us. Both our signals are terrible.
Okay, just repeating, the gravel we use is the easiest to find. The expanded clay pellets, they're good. They offer slightly less protection for roots in terms of large things. If you were supposed to, so let's say you grow millies, we notice that the plants fall over fairly easily on the clay, whereas with gravel, it's heavy enough so that it provides enough of a substrate to keep the plants upright. If you use the tower systems, where you, for instance, if you were to use a tower where you plant strawberries, then yeah, the clay pellets might be less weight, so that might work better. But keeping it simple, I want to say for the home prepper, You can buy gravel at almost any hardware store. It's relatively cheap. It's an easy way to try this out. If you then decide to use a different system, wonderful. But we've used gravel because it was what we could find at the time, and it's always worked, so we've never really changed over.
Stefan, I think just the Okay, sorry about that, guys. It seems that the stream is causing huge issues on both my side and Stefan. What I'm going to do, I see there's still 20 of you watching. For some reason, it keeps basically buffering, and this is with a Ethernet cable attached. Okay, I managed to get Stefan back. Finish. Call it quits. Try and answer all your questions separately. Yeah, I'm going to have to do that, unfortunately, guys. Sorry about the inconvenience, but okay, guys, connectivity issues. Answer everyone's question on the blog. At least you managed to get somewhat of a session out of the whole thing. Yeah, we'll figure out what the causes of it, but the connectivity issues are a huge problem right now. I don't know why it keeps dropping. So we will get to everyone's questions. Thanks for tuning in. If you're still on the Facebook, please tune into my YouTube channel. Please join the YouTube channel so that Facebook doesn't shadow ban me again. And please subscribe to the email list. And we will get Stefan back and we will carry this on. But thank you for tuning in.